The first time I saw the green card, it flashed like a leaf against the dull wires. A small rectangle of stiff paper, the color of spring peas and department store ribbon, held between the fingers of a woman in a sun-faded dress. She stood beyond the fence where the road curved around the pecan orchard, and the air smelled faintly of dust and sweet shells crushed under truck tires. Behind her waited a bookmobile the color of cream, and in its open doorway I could glimpse the spines of books, a neat and impossible forest stacked close. "Library card," she said, as if that explained everything. "If you want to borrow honey, we'll put your name on it." She could not hand it to me. The rules were precise. A guard at the gate sleeves rolled the brim of his cowboy hat folded like a gull's wings, watched with professional boredom. The woman, a librarian, I learned later, her name was Mrs. Lorene Whitcomb, did not touch the fence. She held the card up, letting me see the line for name, the line for address, the box, stamped with the word "good" in green ink. A green card, the peculiar American word for belonging, made small enough to fit in a pocket, and yet for me that day, it could have been the hinge of the world. "Books can't cross," the guard explained, "only hands." But he said it gently. He had Coca-Cola on a crate beside his chair. Condensation had wet the wood to a dark stain, and a metal opener hung on a nail. The librarian's hands were clean and square, faintly inked where the stamp had kissed her skin. I thought of the orders drilled into us back home. Do not fraternize, do not trust, do not be fooled by enemy kindness, and felt the heat lift from the road and hover at the height of our eyes. The librarian was smiling into the glare. "We'll find a way," she said, and it sounded less like defiance than a habit she practiced daily, like pushing a cart down a quiet aisle. Some nights the Americans at the agricultural station held a bonfire for their harvest workers. I had heard the laughter through the trees, the quick Texas yip, the long, laughing sigh, a guitar thinning out into the moth-eaten dark. Once, a rider slipped past the orchard on a chestnut mare named Ruby, the horse's copper flank blinking as if moonlit water rinsed it. The rider tipped his hat at the guardhouse in a greeting that showed his empty hands. A greeting without weapons has a way of changing the weather inside a person. You feel space where you expected weight. On this day, the librarian raised that green card and said my name after I told it to her, Anna Vogel, in a careful way, the vowel long with the surprise of learning. She did not ask what I had done in uniform. She did not ask where I was when the boat took me and the other women from France across the ash-gray Atlantic. She asked instead what I liked to read. Poems, I admitted. My voice sounded uneven, as if every nail in it had been hammered by a different hand. Music, I added, but her face was puzzled. "We'll try stories about music," she said, and her eyes shifted to the guard, who shrugged, then set his bottle down with a tight little clink. And so we agreed each week our work detail would pass by the orchard and the bookmobile. I would tell her the titles I wanted or the kinds of words I needed. She would write them on the green card, and the guard would sign that he had delivered them to the fence. We would not break rules. We would walk them like lines on a page, and still the words might find us. That night, the air inside our barracks was thick with the smell of wool blankets and the faint brass of sweat. Someone near the stove hummed a Texas tune picked up from the radio, a slow, swaying thing with a chorus that lifted like geese from a lake. I lay awake with the image of the green card hovering over my bed, its little stamped "good" glowing like a tiny signal lamp. It was absurd, perhaps, to imagine that a rectangle of paper could shift the angle of a life, but then again, what is a passport or a permit but paper believing it can become a door? I touched the fence the next morning on my way to the work truck palm laid flat to the cool twist of wire, and thought not of borders, but of lines in a score where one staff ends and another begins, and the melody climbs the rungs on its own terms. The lie that lives in us. Before I learned America's dust, I learned its shape in pamphlets. We passed them hand to hand in the barracks of our auxiliary unit, the paper smelling of ink and damp sleeves. America was described as a mouth. It devoured it, chewed, it swallowed, and always what entered it emerged worse, altered by sugar and desire. The women in the pamphlets either painted their lips to a wound or sharpened their mouths to a weapon. The men were myths of fat and fraud. Even their music, we were told, was a kind of sugary infection. Be cautious, our instructor said of the laughter of Americans. They make jokes in order to own you. We believed it because belief was safer than being alone with questions. I had joined the service as a communications aide, a Helferin with stiff collars and a thin paycheck, not out of conviction, but out of momentum. The room where we worked smelled of ozone and burnt dust from the vacuum tubes. We held our headphones as if they were a delicate animal and trained ourselves to listen past our own breathing. It seemed to me then that the world was made of wires and invisible messages, and offense was only the most obvious form of that cheaper magic. We were captured outside Saint-Nazaire, although capture isn't the word for exhaustion given a badge. The war by then had taken on a sound like distant thunder you cannot will away. A truck, a white flag improvised from a nursing smock, and then the slow purgatory of being no longer needed. I remember the American sergeant who said, "You don't look like the monster they promised," and handed me half of his sandwich before he remembered the rules, and took it back confused by his own kindness. In Texas, the camp sat like a parked thought at the edge of a small town. The sign on the road said something about peaches. The sky said something about eternity. The soil was the color of cinnamon, and when the wind kicked, it found whatever small tenderness you had left and salted it. We picked pecans and cotton under guard. We folded laundry for the hospital and learned the schedule of trains by the way sound traveled in dry air. At night, we played cards with soft, inconsequential violence. Once in the mess tent, a Coca-Cola crate stood near the doorway, bottles fat and green, like little church windows, a miracle of cold in a place that had forgotten how to be anything but hot. I did not drink one. I told myself this was a small victory, as if denying my tongue could keep my mind aligned with a home going to pieces without my permission. And yet there were perforations in the certainty. The guard at the gate, the one with the cowboy hat, began to greet us each morning, both palms up, and empty a ritual that felt antique and brave. When the sun got mean, he shifted to put his shadow where we stood. When the canteen ran out of ice, he filled a bucket and pretended it had been there all along. He had a horse named Ruby. He rode on weekends, and sometimes after his shift he would walk her by the fence, the leather creaking the horse's breath a white flag in winter air. Once she snorted and tossed her head, and he laughed and said, "She thinks she's owed applause," and I could not help but laugh too, the sound arriving before permission. The lie in us did not vanish under new weather. It adjusted itself like a coat. The older women called me naive. They said I did not understand how seduction worked, that it wasn't always a kiss. A girl named Herta collected the pamphlets and read aloud the worst parts, installing them like nails in our nightly speech. "They will show you books to make you ashamed of yours," she warned. "They will put music in your head to crowd out your mother's voice." Even the notion of a library caused her to frown, as if the word carried a heat rash no doctor could cure. But I remembered my father's hands stained with metal, and cold, pushing a volume of Heine across the kitchen table when I was 12 and telling me to read the poem about the sea breeze that kisses a cloud. He had kept his softness inside his toolbox wrapped in oily cloth. The world will try to make you hard, he'd said. You must choose what kind of hardness you risk. In America, hardness meant offense. Softness meant a librarian holding out a green card without insisting you be worthy of it. Somewhere between those, a new kind of courage waited mending itself like a tear in a pocket, quietly useful. The bookmobile began to visit the orchard on Thursdays. She told the guard to call her Lorene, and he did, with a reverence that made the name sound older than it was. The first week, she brought a slim volume of stories about a boy and his river, and a book of Texas songs with staff notation. She read me the titles, slowly, making sure the letters did not trample the tune of my name. I can't pass them over, she said, touching the fence with the gentleness a person reserves for sleeping children. But I can read to you, and so we stood there, two women, divided by metal and permissions, while she read a story in which a boy lies to protect a friend because his heart is bigger than his instructions. I felt something unclench. I did not, as Herta would have later said, become an American. I became, for the length of a paragraph, a person whose mind could refuse to be recruited by fear, borrowing what you cannot touch. By the third Thursday, the green card had 3 titles written in Lorene's clean schoolteacher's hand, and my name had learned how to spell itself in English without apology. The guard began to keep a small ledger, what she read, where we paused, which pages made us smile. It was a comedy of sorts, the bureaucracy of tenderness. He would sign his initials with a flourish that made Herta roll her eyes. "Cowboy thinks he's a notary now," she muttered. But I liked that the kindness had to be recorded. It made the world seem contractually bound to allow it. One evening, after our work detail returned dusty as biscuits, we heard guitar from the far field. A group of farm hands had a fire going inside a ring of old plow blades. The music drifted toward our fence, a Texas waltz, the notes wobbling under a firm hand like a child learning to ride a bicycle. The women in my barracks moved toward the sound as water leans toward its own. The guard at the corner post lifted a hand, worried about the rule against gathering at the fence. Then he saw how we stood, not demanding, not pleading, only listening, and he lowered his hand again. Someone passed a bottle of Coca-Cola between the men, and when it came back to the guitarist, he set it beside him like a little lantern. In the firelight, the green glass pulsed, and I felt a tender foolishness. War is a machine for turning objects into symbols, and here I was nearly weeping at a soda bottle, a trophy of peacetime. A week later, Lorene arrived with a hat on. Not her hat. A cowboy hat, obviously borrowed too big for her head, but perched at an angle that made her look both serious and lightly amused, as if she were daring the sun to say something rude. She carried a record sleeve under one arm and a stack of index cards under the other. She explained almost apologetically that these were green cards they gave to new borrowers, just colored stock, nothing official, not the immigration papers the men in town joked about. Still, she said brightly, it's a little passport in our small republic of reading. Then came the test delivered, not by any authority, but by our own private governments. Herta confronted me outside the barracks, her lips pinched hair wound in curlers as if vanity could be a weapon. "You smile at the librarian like she's your aunt," she accused. "You drink their music like water. Next, you'll be riding their horses." She meant it as a curse. It sounded like a dare. The next Thursday, the cowboy himself, the guard with the gentle hands, brought Ruby to the orchard. "She's been watching y'all long enough," he said, and the horse flicked an ear as if to agree. He didn't come close to the fence. He kept to the far edge of the field and walked her in a figure 8 that drew the scent of leather and dust toward us. When he took off his hat to wipe his brow, he looked younger, less like a carved man and more like someone's brother. "I can't let you ride," he called, "but I can let you watch me teach her something new." He tapped her flank, once a whisper of heel, and Ruby sprang forward, not running so much as remembering how. He made a circle, and then another, tightening them until the chestnut flank gleamed and the horse's breath came hard. He slowed her with a word that sounded like forgiveness, and patted her neck. The sound of his hand on her was a rhythm I recognized from music class, the count-in before a song begins. Without warning, he pointed at me then, at his own eyes, then at Ruby's foreleg where the fetlock lifted and fell with a dancer's care. "Up," he said. I lifted my hand to the fence and with my fingers matched the horse's step. Up, down, up. A line of metal, a line of muscle, a line of faith. Freedom is sometimes only the right to move in time with something beautiful. Later, when the sun slid behind the silo and turned the air to pewter, Lorene opened the record sleeve and showed me the label A Texas Waltz, recorded in Austin, the paper the same fine green as the card. "The library runs a listening room," she said. "No talking, just music. You sign your name and you get 30 minutes with a needle and nobody's opinions. Isn't that dangerous?" I asked before I could stop myself. "What listening?" She laughed the kindly laughter of the well-rooted. "Dangerous is pretending we're not made to be changed." I thought of Herta and her pamphlets. I thought of Ruby's step under a language older than fences. And I thought of the green card with my name on it, legal nowhere, powerful everywhere between us. That night, I wrote my father's poem from memory on a scrap of packing paper, the lines lurching where I could not find them whole. I tucked the paper inside my pillowcase. Over our bunks, the moon rose until the wire could not help but glitter. Somewhere in the orchard, a fox trotted the fence line, choosing not to slip through free, to leave, and so content, at least for now, to pace the idea of leaving. A door made of dust and courtesy. The storm came in September. Not rain, we would have blessed rain like a visiting saint, but a dust storm, the kind that teaches you what your teeth are for. Midday darkened to a sepia embarrassment. The pecan trees thrashed like insulted girls. From the road, the bookmobile's horn let out 2 short bleats, then fell silent. We were on laundry detail, and the sheets turned into flags, then weapons. The guard ran down the line, shouting for us to cover our mouths, and tossed us bandanas that smelled of clean cotton and something medicinal. Perhaps his wife's careful drawer. I thought of Lorene in that wind-small stubborn, wrapped in a hat too big for her, and felt terror unlace itself from its usual braided utilities and run wild. I did something wrong. I left the covered trench where we were meant to wait. I pulled my bandana up and charged into the orchard vision jammed down to a slot of road and fence. Behind me, Herta shouted my name, half warning, half proof for her future indictment. The dust made everything featureless. Even the fence lost its edges. You could walk into it and not see yourself wounded until later. At the curve, the bookmobile was a pale animal hunkered under the lash of wind. Lorene had the door open a crack to keep books from cooking inside. She had tied her hair with a green ribbon that leapt like a trapped grass snake. When she saw me, she did not make a speech about rules. She didn't even scold, though fear stood bright in her pupils. She pointed to her mouth and made the sign for breath, then to the ground, then to my hands. We crouched backs to the wind, pressed close to the fence so our bodies made a windbreak and breathed through the heat and grit. Her hand came up, palm-out fingers spread the same empty-handed greeting the cowboy used each morning. I mirrored it. Our palms faced each other 5 inches and a law apart. I remembered suddenly my mother teaching me how to thank the bread before cutting it. A small hand held over another small hand, a prayer not to waste the life it held. The wind snapped, then hesitated. In that wrinkle of quiet, she spoke through the cloth. "I brought you something." She slid an index card through the diamond of the fence. It was not against rules to pass paper, only objects with weight, though everything has weight when you need it. The card was the green of a library door in the late afternoon. Across the top, she had written in pencil so neat it might have been printed "green card for fence reading," and underneath my name. She had dated it, and under the date she had drawn a single line of music, 3 notes with the word "waltz." At the bottom, in small letters, "good" stamped twice. The dust rose again, roaring, and a branch snapped somewhere and something metal clanged. She pressed her hand to the fence. Without thinking, I did the same. Wire bit my skin. She lifted her hand slightly so that only our shadows aligned. The gesture was nothing. The gesture was the whole thing. A ritual performed to remind a storm that there is such a thing as custom, as agreement, as ceremony, in which no one owns anyone and everyone belongs to the same patient breath. The storm passed away. All tempers do not when the offender repents, but when it runs out of itself. The world exhaled. Dust settled into our hair, into the crook of the fence, into the pages of the books. I could taste the mineral in it like a cheap argument. The guard found me at the road and did not say the words the rule book required. He took off his hat, looked at Lorene, looked at me, and said, "You okay?" The question was not an accusation. It was inventory. He looked at my hand, bleeding at the palm, a tiny cut dark against the pale grit, and opened the crate near his chair. He fished out a bottle of Coca-Cola, pried the cap with the nailed opener, and held it toward me. I shook my head because I had made a ceremony of refusing sweetness. He held it out again, his eyebrows pleading as if my thirst were a test of his decency. I took the bottle. It was cold enough to make my teeth sing. The first swallow tasted like dare and caramel and a fresh decision. When I finished, he took the bottle, tilted it to see the sunlight through the green glass, and said, "I reckon that's the first fence-safe medicine we've issued." Herta confronted me that night, but her anger had the wobble of a wheel a week from breaking. "You think the card makes you special," she said. "You think you can sit at their fire and not smell like smoke." I looked at my palm where the wire had cut and thought of Lorene's small pencil notes. I understood suddenly that the card did not make me special. It made me accountable. To the language in which it was written. To the idea that someone could write your name and mean to keep it safe. To the quiet republic of those who believe freedom is a thing you practice like honesty, mostly when no one is watching. The next Thursday, the orchard was green, as if the storm had been a trick of stagecraft, and Lorene read us the last chapters of the River Boy's book. When she came to the part where he refuses to give up his friend, she paused and raised her eyes to mine. Neither of us smiled. There are some recognitions that break a person into more of herself and then set the pieces back with better glue. Letters through time, or the fence that became a shelf. When the war broke in two and the pieces fell across maps like ash, when trains turned into sermons about return and forgiveness, our barracks began to empty. Men first, then the women whose papers were easiest. I waited. I learned to wait well. The green card lived inside my pillowcase, then in my shoe, then in the hem of my skirt, where I stitched it like a relic. I wrote to my father, but did not know where to address the letter. I wrote to my mother, but did not know if she still had the hands to open it. On the morning we left, the guard with the cowboy hat stood at the gate, not as a functionary but as a neighbor. He had Ruby saddled as if she too needed to witness departures in order to understand arrivals. He raised both hands empty one last time, then put one hand to his brow in a salute like a folded prayer. Lorene came too without the bookmobile, just herself and a paper sack. For the train, she said, handing me sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a small envelope with my name. Don't open it yet. We lingered as people do at fences, finding new reasons to keep the moment breathing. Finally, the driver coughed his engine into the conversation and we climbed into the truck that would begin the few thousand miles of our return. As we jolted away, Lorene put her hand up in a gesture I had learned belonged to the prayerful, under no particular creed. I returned it, palm to palm, air between us like a vow made to time not to make us strangers. In Bremerhaven, the harbor smelled of iron and old curses. The buildings looked bitten. People moved with the careful energy of post-surgery patients learning again how to be inside their bodies without the anesthesia of emergency. I found work in a stationer's shop stamping dates into invoices. The ink was cheaper than American ink. It amused me to discover how much the quality of a stamp could teach you about a country's mood. I lodged in a room where the window shut only if you coaxed it in the dialect of hinges. The green card lived in the drawer with my extra stockings. At night, I took it out and looked at the small notes Lorene's pencil softened by the oil of my fingers. Waltz. Good. The date of the dust storm, the day I had taken the Coca-Cola. Sometimes I pressed it to my palm where the fence had cut me a lining paper scar to skin scar until some private geometry of healing seemed to click. I wrote letters I did not send. Then, one winter, the postman found our building and brought me an envelope with Texas in the return corner. I sat with it on my lap so long the cold said something impolite to my knees. Inside, a photograph of the bookmobile parked under the orchard, a ribbon of writing on the back Lorene's hand. Dear Anna, it read, the fence is still here, but it holds up more sky than it used to. I think that's what good fences do when people behave. There was no philosophy beyond that. Just a list of the titles she had read that year to the children of farmhands, and an invitation that sounded like a story. If you ever come back, the listening room has new records. Years move in strange curves when you count by peacetime. I married a man who sold bicycles and did not mind that I slept sometimes with a card in my fist like a ritual. We had a daughter, Elsa, whose first word was open, pronounced like a blessing. When she was 10, she wrote an essay at school about a thing that kept its promise, and she described the green card as if it had taken us all to market. My husband laughed, then looked as if something inside him had slipped sweetly, like a knot finally learned. I returned to Texas decades later. Else wanted to see the place where grandmother's freedom had a fence. The town was ordinary, the way sacred places always are, embarrassed by the size of other people's feelings. The orchard had fewer trees. The library had more windows. A plaque stood near the old campsite, the text careful not to bruise anyone, and yet it bruised me with its politeness. At the public library, the air smelled like warm plastic and the long patience of pages. A young librarian, hair in a bun, so efficient it felt like a mission statement, looked at my card and then at me, as if I had laid a small green wing on the desk. We keep the old cards in the archive, she said, if you'd like to donate. She spoke the last word as if it could mean deliverance. I had expected triumph. I had expected to be able to uncurl my fingers without cost. But the green card, after all these years, had the weight of a coin that had paid for something invisible and large. I held it. I thought of Lorene's hand on the fence of the waltz, moving its 3 steps against our 2 different weathers of the guard, who kept his hands empty as a form of doctrine. I thought of Herta, whose lie had been a shield she could not afford to drop, and who in my memory still stands in curlers beneath a sky that wanted to forgive her. Objects carry forward the versions of ourselves that made them important. To give the green card away felt like betraying the girl who had hidden it in her hem. To keep it felt like distrusting the woman who had taught me that good things get larger when they are shared. "May I see your archives first?" I asked. The room had a hum, like bees manufactured by fluorescent lights. Boxes, labels, the small, elegant fossil record of a town looking after its own soul. The young librarian, whose name turned out to be Marie, opened a box with a hiss of tape. Inside a ledger, names written in sepia fountain pen, the ink faded to the color of old leaves. A photograph, the bookmobile, the cowboy leaning against it, Ruby's bridle in his hand, as if for a portrait. And there, green cards from years that looked both near and far edges furred by thumb and time. Some had notes returned, late due to baby. "Please renew if the river is still rising. This child loves the one about the donkey." The empire of reading recorded itself without pride, just the way water keeps notes on stones. I placed my card on the table. Marie made a small sound people make only in libraries and at funerals. "Would you like your name in our catalog?" she asked. Voice lowered with a deference she felt she owed to the past. "We can note the story. We can note the fence." "Yes," I said, and the word felt like allowing a horse to choose her path home. We wrote the donor form together. Else took a photo of my hand on the glass of the display case. Looking at my palm under the light, the fence scar was a pale thread sewn long ago, neat work by an amateur saint. Marie asked if I wanted to add a line to the caption. I thought of speeches I might make, then refused them kindly. "Just write," I said. "Freedom is not a place, it is a habit." And if you have space, write, "Thank you, Lorene Whitcomb, for the borrowed courage." Outside evening, through long cotton shadows across the parking lot. We walked toward the car, 3 steps to the bar of a remembered waltz. A man in a cowboy hat approached younger than my memory needed him to be. He tipped his hat in a greeting without weapons. Ruby would be gone by now, her good work done, her breath given back to grass. But the shape of our days still carried the story of her step. Else asked, "Mama, did you ever actually ride a horse here?" I shook my head. "No, I learned to match a step through a fence." She looked thoughtful in a way that young people are when they realize stories are made of realistic impossibilities. On the flight home, I wrote a letter that took me the whole altitude to finish. "Dear Lorene," I began, though I knew the letter would arrive only at the border between gratitude and air. "You taught me that a card is a promise. A fence is a teacher, and a librarian is a freedom officer with pockets full of passports. You taught me that kindness is not the opposite of discipline, but its best cousin. You taught me to drink a Coca-Cola in a dust storm as if it were communion, to let a hat mean the weather rather than the war, to hear a waltz as a way to count the beats between strangers. You taught me to practice freedom until my hands remembered it, without telling my head. I did not sign it with my married name. I signed it with the one written in pencil on the green card, because that was the self I owed the most, the girl in a foreign orchard who let a small, improbable republic issue her a document good for nothing and everything. I placed the letter in the seat-back pocket, though I knew it had nowhere to go, except where such letters go to the version of us who waits patiently at the fence, learning how to open without a key. When we landed, Elsa took my hand the way children still do long after they believe themselves grown. "What will you do now that the card is gone?" she asked. I told her the truth. I will borrow more carefully. I will return more gladly. The sky over home was the same color as the green card if you squinted against the rain. We walked toward the terminal 3 small notes to the bar, and in the silence between doors I heard again the librarian's voice. "We'll find a way." It's a sentence big enough to hand through any fence. It's a sentence you can live on for years. And in the hush that follows, a question remains patient. As a book you are finally ready to open. What habit of freedom are you willing to practice today?